A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lagus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 19, Shadows on the Threshold. Shadows of the Cadmea. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the limestone courtyards of the Cadmea, baking the dust and the scent of crushed olive leaves into the heavy Boeotian air. In the open training square between the barracks and the page quarters, the clatter of wood striking leather and the rhythmic grunts of exertion filled the space. Iolaus, 17 and standing on the precipice of full membership in the civic ranks, leaned heavily on a blunt training ziston, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a callous forearm. Around him, his peers, Agus, Sinane, Antigonus, Python, Leonidas, Amintor, Batas, and Lagus, were finishing a brutal round of formation drills under the watchful eye of a Theban drill sergeant. Antigonus, 14 and already possessing a stubborn, broad-shouldered frame, adjusted his bronze chest guard with a scowl. Every day they pound us into these formations, he thought, his jaw tightening. They want us to think like Boeotians, to move as one mindless unit. But a man doesn't survive the highlands or the wars to come by blending into a wall of shields. Beside him, Python and Leonidas caught their breath, their expressions hardened by the same shared exile. Python wiped the dust from his eyes, while Leonidas stared out toward the western horizon, his mind wandering far beyond the stone walls of Thebes. They call us honored guests, but we are prisoners wrapped in purple wool, Leonidas thought bitterly. Every tactical lesson they drill into us is meant to bind us to their political orbit. We are leverage against Pella. Amintor, quiet and analytical, carefully checked the binding on his wooden spear shaft, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the wider courtyard. Let them teach us their oblique lines and their collective maneuvers, Amintor told himself. We will take their iron discipline, absorb every secret their generals have to offer, and when the time comes to break these chains, we will use their own weapons against them. Iolaus caught his breath, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter toward the shaded colonnade where the younger boys were gathered. We were just like them 3 winters ago, Iolaus thought, watching the younger cohort struggle with the basic postures. Dragged from home, thrust into stone barracks, wondering if the walls would crush us. If we don't keep a hand on them, the isolation will eat them alive. Antigonus, Python, you're dragging your feet, Iolaus called out, his voice carrying the hard, authoritative rasp of a senior cadet. Batas? Lagus, halt your drills. You're trailing your left flanks again. Go check the page quarters. Make sure the younger ones are squared away before the evening muster. Batas, 14 and breathing hard, wiped his nose with a dusty wrist, nodding sharply. Understood, Iolaus? Come on, Lagus, Antigonus. Let's go see how the little ones are surviving the heat. Antigonus grunted, falling into step alongside them. If Archidamus has spilled his ink pot again today, I'm throwing his wax tablets into the cistern. Lagus adjusted his belt, his face flushed from the sun. Phaedrus probably has half the younger cohort crying over their grammar tablets by now. As the older youths crossed the sun-bleached courtyard toward the stone portico of the page quarters, the scene shifted from the raw sweat of the barracks to a quieter, more vulnerable ecosystem. There sat the 4 youngest hostages. Phaedrus, 11, trying desperately to maintain an air of stoic dignity. Archidamus, 10, frantically scrubbing ink off his fingers. Polycles, 9, clutching a wooden toy horse close to his chest. And Drusillus, 8, the youngest of all, staring miserably down at a torn sandal strap. All right, you lot, up, Batas announced, stepping into the shade of the colonnade. He crossed his arms, trying to mimic the stern posture of their Theban commanders, though a faint, brotherly grin betrayed him, at the corners of his mouth. Are we breathing, or did the midday heat finish you all off? Phaedrus quickly straightened his posture, tossing his styling stylus onto his wax tablet with a sharp clack. We are fine, Batas. Archidamus just spilled his ink over the entire paradigm of verb declensions. Archidamus flushed crimson, frantically rubbing his stained fingers against his tunic. It was the wind. A gust blew through the portico. He's terrified of falling behind, Batas thought, his gaze softening as he looked at the 10-year-old. He thinks a single ink stain means a one-way ticket back to a court where he'll be treated as a political failure. I remember that exact terror. Batas stepped forward, dropping to one knee so he was at eye level with Archidamus. He pulled a clean linen rag from his own satchel and handed it over. Here, use this before the instructor inspects the tablets. Ink washes out. A bad impression on the senior magistrates doesn't. Breathe, Archidamus. Antigonus leaned against a marble pillar, crossing his arms as he watched the younger boys. Despite his usual rough exterior, a flicker of genuine empathy crossed his features. They're just children, Antigonus thought. They shouldn't have to carry the weight of kingdoms on their shoulders before they've even learned how to hold a proper shield. He reached into his pouch, pulling out a dried fig, and tossed it deftly to Polycles, who caught it with wide, startled eyes. Eat that. You look like you're about to faint. Lagus, meanwhile, knelt beside the youngest two. He gently reached down to take Drasilus's broken sandal, inspecting the frayed leather strap with practiced fingers. He's barely big enough to carry a helmet, let alone march out to the Boeotian plains, Lagus thought with a sudden pang of protective kinship. If we don't watch out for them, who here will? Hey, Drasilis, Lagus murmured softly, pulling a small strip of softened ox hide from his pocket. Look at me. Your sandal gave out? Drasilis sniffled, nodding miserably. I tripped over the stone threshold during the poetry recitation. Everyone laughed. Let them laugh, Lagus said firmly, beginning to stitch the leather back together with a bone needle. Next time, trip them back when they aren't looking. Just make sure the Theban guards don't catch you. Here, hold the steady. Polycles inched closer, still clutching his wooden horse, his wide eyes darting between Lagus and the distant barracks. Is it true, Lagus? Are the older ones going to take us to the lower gymnasium tomorrow for wrestling basics? Before Lagus could answer, heavy footsteps echoed across the flagstones. Pethan, Leonidas, Amyntar, Sinane, and Agus jogged over from the training square, joining their comrades in the shade. Agus, 15 and built like a young bull, clapped a heavy, reassuring hand onto Pheididus's shoulder, nearly knocking the 11-year-old off his stool. You heard the boy, Sinane said, a sharp, confident grin lighting up his face. Tomorrow at dawn, the whole lot of you are stepping onto the gravel pit with us. No more hiding behind wax tablets and ink pots. We're going to teach you how to take a fall without breaking your collarbones. Leonidas stepped forward, offering a rare, encouraging smile to Drasilis. And don't worry about the Theban instructors. If they push you too hard, just remember, we survived Pella, and we will survive this. Pheididus straightened his back, puffing out his chest to match the older boy's energy. We aren't afraid of the gravel pit. Good, Amyntar nodded quietly, his voice carrying a steady, calming weight. Because discipline is built one step at a time. We stick together and nothing breaks us. As the older youths gathered around the younger ones, swapping quiet jokes, inspecting damaged gear, and sharing smuggled provisions from the mess hall, the invisible walls between Category 1 and Category 2 melted away. In the heart of an alien city, far from the snow-capped mountains of their birth, these ties forged in sweat and shared exile became an unbreakable chain. We are foreigners here, Iolaus thought, watching from the edge of the courtyard as Antigonus clapped a reassuring hand on Archidamus' shoulder. They can keep us as hostages, they can drill us until our muscles tear, and they can try to break our names. But as long as we hold each other up, no one here walks alone. Architecture of power. The morning light cut through the high barred windows of the Cadmea's lecture hall, casting long, sharp beams across rows of polished oak desks and scattered wax tablets. There were no wooden shields here, no bronze greaves clanking against the floor. Instead, the room was thick with the scent of cedar oil, melting beeswax, and the low, intense murmur of debate. Here, in the heart of Category 1's academic quarters, the older cadets sat shoulder to shoulder, under the watchful eyes of a Theban philosopher. Iolaus, 17 and sitting near the front, traced the edge of a geometric theorem etched into his slate. The Thebans think teaching us geometry is merely about building siege engines or laying out camp perimeters, Iolaus thought, his eyes narrowing as he stared at intersecting lines. They don't realize we are mapping out the architecture of power itself. Every angle of a triangle is an angle of approach. Every calculation of space is a lesson in how to crush an enemy before the first spear is thrown. Beside him, Amyntar leaned over his own tablet, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Let them lecture us on justice and the fall of states, Amyntar reflected, his mind racing past the instructor's droning voice. Epaminondas believes a true commander must balance the state with philosophy. Fine. We will swallow every word of their political theory, master their dialectic, and learn precisely why democratic assemblies fracture and tyrants fall. When we return to Pella, we won't just bring back steel, we will bring the intellectual machinery to govern an empire. Further down the bench, Python and Leonidas passed a shared text of Homer between them, their fingers tracing the lines of epic hexameter before sliding a sheet of rhetorical notes across the desk. They force us to master the lyre to harmonize our souls, Leonidas thought, suppressing a grim, cynical smile as he listened to the faint, distant tuning of strings from an adjoining room. They want docile, well-tempered instruments of the Boeotian League. But poetry and rhetoric are weapons of persuasion. If you can move an assembly with words, you don't even need to draw a sword to make a city fall. Across the aisle, Agis and Synane were locked in a fierce, silent mental contest over a political dialogue concerning the collapse of oligarchies. Look at how the Thebans dissect factionalism, Synane thought, his jaw set tightly. They think they are teaching us obedience to federal law. But every lesson on civil discord is a blueprint on how to exploit internal decay. We are learning how societies tear themselves apart from the inside out. Antigonus sat slightly apart, his broad shoulders hunched over a complex calculation of ratios and architectural stresses, his expression stubbornly unreadable. They can cage us behind these stone walls, force us through their dual curriculum, and treat us like royal collateral, Antigonus thought, pressing his stylus hard enough into the wax to fracture the edge. They call us hostages. But every hour spent in this hall makes us sharper, heavier, and more dangerous. Let them teach us everything they know. We are building the cage from the inside, and one day, the bars won't hold us. Up at the podium, the Theban instructor paused his lecture on the nature of justice, his gaze sweeping across the young foreign faces sitting before him. Minds being sharpened like double-edged blades in the very heart of the state that sought to contain them. Shadows of the northern home. The heavy oak doors of Archidamus's peristyle courtyard muffled the sounds of the upper Cadmea, but they could not keep out the quiet, persistent misery that had settled over the household. For the youngest foreign wards, the 5 to 7-year-olds scattered across the elite estates of Thebes, life had settled into a rigid, gilded cage. Every day followed the same unbroken routine. Waking before dawn under the watchful eye of a Boeotian tutor, reciting unaccustomed vowels on wax tablets, eating silently, and practicing stiff, formal postures meant to honor the households that held them. In the sunlit corner of the courtyard, 5-year-old Cletus, already possessing a shock of dark, unruly hair and a stubborn set to his jaw that would one day earn him the name the Black, sat huddled with Phormio, 5, and Cylon, 6. Near them, Lysias, 7, the oldest of this little group, stared blankly at a wooden toy horse. He no longer had the heart to move across the paving stones. Across town in the grand estate of Pelopidas, a parallel silence reigned among the young wards fostered by Timoclea, Corhagus, 7, Menelaus, 6, Simmias, 5, and Polemon, 5, along with Pelopidas's own young son, Ariston. Here, the routine was wearing them down to the bone. Cletus let out a small, jagged sniffle, wiping his nose with the sleeve of his tunic. He clutched a corner of his woolen cloak as if it were a lifeline. "I am a Macedonian," he told himself, repeating the phrase his older cousins had muttered before the long march south over the Pindus Mountains. A Macedonian doesn't weep in the courtyards of strangers. Yet the iron discipline of a soldier's pride meant nothing against the crushing weight of a 5-year-old's loneliness. "I want my mother," he whispered, his voice cracking with the raw, desperate grief of a child who had been dragged over mountains and locked behind stone walls. "I want to see my sister, Lanek. Why won't they let us go home?" Phormio buried his face in his small hands, his shoulders shaking. Every day is the same. The same gray porridge, the same stern voices. "I want my brother in the barracks. I want Iolaus." Lysias, trying desperately to hold on to 7-year-old dignity, bit his lower lip until it turned white. But a single tear spilled over his lashes, tracking a clean line through the dust on his cheek. "They said, 'We are guests,'" Lysias choked out, his voice trembling. "Guests don't have guards at the gates. We're prisoners. I want my father." Inside the cool, shadowed colonnade of Archidamus's home, Gorgo stood motionless by a marble pillar, her hands tightly gripping the fabric of her stola, her heart twisted violently in her chest. She watched the little boys, so far from Pella, so heartbreakingly small against the vast austere machinery of the Boeotian state, breaking apart under the weight of their exile. They are just babies, Gorgo thought, a profound ache rising in her throat as she heard little Cletus softly crying. We feed them, we clothe them, we teach them letters, but we cannot give them back their homes. This slow, daily breaking of their spirits is cruelty wrapped in silk. That evening, when the sun dipped below the western hills and cast long, bruised shadows across the Cadmea, the emotional toll spilled over into the highest chambers of Theban leadership. In the private courtyard of Pelopidas' estate, Timoclea stood waiting by the bronze oil lamps as her husband, Pelopidas, walked in from the assembly, heavy with the burdens of the Boeotian League. Before he could unfasten his travel cloak, Timoclea stepped directly into his path, her eyes flashing with a fierce, unwavering resolve. You must stop this, Pelopidas, Timoclea said, her voice dropping low, charged with an intensity that made the general pause. Pelopidas frowned, running a tired hand over his beard. What is it, Timoclea? Has there been unrest in the lower city? Not in the city. In our courtyards, she answered, her voice breaking slightly before hardening again. I found little Simmias and Corhagus weeping themselves to sleep again tonight. They aren't plotting against Thebes, Pelopidas. They are children. 5, 6, 7 years old. They are starving for the sight of their brothers in the barracks, starving for anyone who smells like home, like their mothers, like the mountains of the north. Pelopidas looked away, his jaw tightening. He knew the political necessity of holding the foreign wards. It was the bedrock of their peace with Macedon. But looking at his wife, he saw the mirror of his own conscience. The magistrates say mixing the quarters too often breeds conspiracies, Pelopidas murmured defensively. Conspiracies? Timoclea stepped closer, her gaze pinning him in place. They are crying for their mothers into their wool blankets. Their agony is breaking the very walls of our houses. If you are men of honor, if the sacred band fights for love and brotherhood, how can you watch these little ones wither away in solitary cages? You will arrange a gathering. You will bring the older cadets from the barracks and the boys from the foster houses together under one roof, and you will let them see their brothers before grief breaks them entirely. Pelopidas stared at his wife for a long, silent moment, the stern general giving way to a man who understood the crushing weight of loyalty. He slowly lowered his head and nodded. Tomorrow, Pelopidas said quietly, I will speak to Epaminondas. The barriers come down for a day. The heavy oak door of the Theban magistrate's courtyard shut out the midday heat of the following afternoon, leaving only the sound of grinding stones from the kitchen and the dry rasp of cicadas in the olive trees. Cletus sat huddled on the low stone bench, his knees pulled up against his chest, gripping the rough wool of his cloak. A soft footstep sounded on the flagstones, but Cletus didn't look up, wishing he could shrink until he vanished entirely into the stone. Cletus. The voice wasn't the sharp, demanding bark of the Boeotian tutor, nor the heavy, tired cadence of his foster father, Archidamus. It was a phantom voice, soft, familiar, and carrying the crisp, bright cadence of the northern highlands. Cletus jerked his head up, his dark eyes wide and blinking against the glare. Standing at the edge of the peristyle, framed by white marble columns and green laurel leaves, was Lanike. She wasn't supposed to be here. In the rigid hierarchy of royal hostages, young noble girls remained sequestered or stayed behind in Pella. But as part of Pelopidas and Timocles' sudden arrangement to crack open the doors of the noble estates, Lanike, having arrived with a secondary delegation of royal attendants, had searched the courtyards until she found him. For a second, Cletus simply stared, convinced his heartbreak was playing tricks on his mind. Then his lower lip quivered. Lanike, he breathed, his voice barely a squeak. Lanike didn't walk, she ran. In 3 swift strides across the courtyard, she dropped to her knees right in front of the stone bench, throwing her arms around his small, rigid shoulders and pulling him violently against her chest. All the stoicism, all the forced maturity of trying to act like a captive prince in a strange city shattered instantly. Cletus let out a ragged, choking sob and hurled himself into her arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He grabbed handfuls of her tunic, clutching her as tightly as he had clutched his woolen cloak, terrified that if he let go, she would dissolve back into the Boeotian sunlight. I'm here, little wolf, Lanike whispered fiercely. her own voice thick with unshed tears as she pressed her cheek against his messy, dark curls. She rocked him back and forth on the stone bench, her hands rubbing soothing circles down his back. "I'm right here. I found you." They locked the gates. Cletus sobbed into her tunic, the words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic stream of grievance. "They make us sit on the benches and write strange letters on wax. The food isn't right. And nobody smells like home, Lenaik. Why did they bring us here? Why won't they let us go back to Pella?" Lenaik held him tighter, her gaze lifting over his small shoulder to stare out at the high stone walls of the Cadmea. Her jaw tightened, a flash of fierce, protective anger hardening her features, mirroring the stubborn spirit that lived in both of them. "They brought us here because kings play games with children's lives," Cletus, Lenaik murmured, her voice steady and low, meant only for his ear. "They think stone walls and strange alphabet tablets can make us forget who we are. They think they can tame us." She pulled back just enough to take his small ink-stained face in both of her hands, forcing him to look directly into her eyes. She wiped a stray tear from his cheek with her thumb, her gaze unyielding and fierce. "Listen to me, Cletus the Black," she said, using the moniker already beginning to cling to his stubborn defiance. "They can keep us behind these gates and they can make us walk their courtyards. But they cannot touch what is inside us. We are Macedonians. We endure. And we never forget where we belong." Cletus sniffled loudly, his chest still heaving with the remnants of his tears, but the wild, blind panic in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a fierce, answering spark. He reached up and wiped his nose with the back of his hand, nodding slowly. "Are you staying?" he asked quietly, his small fingers still gripping the hem of her sleeve. Lenaik offered a small, fierce smile, sliding onto the bench right beside him, and pulling him into her side, where the shade of the laurel tree fell across them both. "For today," Lenaik said, wrapping her arms securely around his shoulders. "For today, nobody is going anywhere. Tell me everything they've been trying to teach you, and I'll tell you how we're going to survive it." Golden beggars of Sparta. The chill of November bit deep into the stone of the Spartan agora, turning the breath of the few passing citizens into gray ghosts that vanished against the bleak, unyielding backdrop of Mount Taygetus. Inside the Spartan Senate House, the air was heavy with the smell of old charcoal, cold sweat, and quiet desperation. King Agesilaus II sat on his low stool at the head of the assembly, his withered legs stretched before him, his fingers rhythmically tapping against the head of his iron-bound walking staff. Before him stood two returning envoys, their cloaks stiff with salt unmountain sleet, their faces exhausted from a desperate, humiliating journey across the Aegean. Lysander, standing among the council of ephors, leaned forward, his voice cutting sharply through the gloomy silence. "You have returned from across the water. Tell the assembly plainly, did the Persian satraps or the island treasuries listen, or do they mock a Sparta that begs with empty hands?" Procles, the senior envoy, swallowed hard, his throat dry. He exchanged a brief, bleak glance with his companion before looking up at the king. "We went where the council commanded, my lords," Procles said, his voice dropping low. "We traveled to the satrapal courts along the Ionian coast and whispered in the halls of independent dynasts. We reminded them that a balance of power in Greece is their only safeguard against Theban expansion, but..." He hesitated. "Spit it out," Agesilaus commanded, his voice like grinding flint. "Do they give us gold, or do they offer pity?" "They offer neither, King Agesilaus," Procles replied, his head bowing in shame. "They looked at our threadbare chitons, at the shrunken size of our retinue, and they saw the truth." The satraps laughed. One of them, a commander under Mausolus, asked me straight to my face, "Why should the great king or any free city invest gold in a ghost? Sparta has no fleet, no tribute from Messenia, and no power left to enforce a treaty. You are asking us to buy a corpse." A sharp murmur of outrage rippled through the older benches of the Gerousia, but it quickly died away, choked by the bitter, inescapable reality of their situation. Agesilaus did not shout. He did not slam his staff against the stone. He simply closed his eyes for a long, agonizing moment, feeling the centuries of Spartan pride crumbling away beneath his boots like dry autumn soil. "They are right, and it burns my soul to admit it," Agesilaus thought, a cold, hollow ache spreading through his chest as he remembered the glory days when Spartan kings dictated law from the Bosporus to Crete. We spent centuries teaching the Greek world to fear our spears, but we never learned how to survive without our helots, and we never built a treasury of gold. Now, when our backs are pressed against Thebes and the Arcadian League hems us in from the north, we send men across the sea to rattle tin cups at foreign kings, only to be turned away like common vagrants. And Dionysius? Agesilaus asked quietly, his eyes snapping open, fixing Proclus with a piercing, desperate intensity. Did you reach out to the tyrant of Syracuse? Did the ships of Sicily offer us no hope? A small vessel of grain and a handful of mercenaries may slip past the Athenian patrols if we are lucky. My king, Proclus answered cautiously. The tyrant sympathizes, but Dionysius has his own wars in Magna Graecia. He will not risk his fleet for a power that cannot even secure its own frontier. Lysander clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Then we are truly abandoned. If land defense alone is failing against Epaminondas's phalanx, and our allies have vanished into the Arcadian League, how are we supposed to hold this valley when the spring thaw brings their armies to our gates? Agesilaus slowly pushed himself up from his seat, leaning heavily on his staff, his tall, lean frame towering over the assembly. The ancient king looked out across the faces of his remaining counselors, men grown old before their time, carrying the grief of Leuctra and the terror of an uncertain tomorrow. We stopped looking across the sea for saviors, Lysander, Agesilaus said, his voice steady, carrying the chilling, iron resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. The gold of Susa will not save Sparta. The tyrants of Sicily will not bleed for our honor. If the world wants a corpse, we will show them how a Spartan corpse fights when its teeth are bared. He stepped toward the heavy oak doors, gazing out toward the darkening southern horizon, where the shadows were lengthening across the Eurytus. Double the patrols on the Laconian passes tonight, Agesilaus ordered without looking back. Melt down the decorative bronze shields and the lesser shrines if we lack metal for spear tips. If we must fall, we will fall on our own terms, guarding this narrow valley with every drop of blood we have left. Envoys of the owl. The salt air of the Piraeus bit sharply through heavy wool cloaks, but the chill inside the long room of the Athenian strategian was of an entirely different nature. By the dim, flickering light of a clustered row of oil lamps, Callistratus stood before a massive cedar map table spread with charts of the Aegean, the Hellespont, and the sprawling, inquashed territories of the Persian Empire. Around him sat Athens' chosen delegation for the upcoming Imperial Congress at Susa. Timagoras, veteran statesman and sharp-eyed pragmatist, and several junior scribes clutching stacks of diplomatic credentials, ancient treaty transcripts, and trade manifests. Callistratus slammed his palm down onto the table, rattling the clay inkwells. We are not going to Susa to ask for favors, and we are certainly not going to beg, Callistratus said, his voice dropping into a harsh, controlled whisper that echoed off the damp stone walls. We are going to stop Thebes from signing away our lifeblood on a royal parchment. If Artaxerxes gives Epaminondas total Persian naval sanction, Thebes will build the fleet they are dreaming of, and our maritime empire will be choked to death in our own harbors. Timagoras leaned back in his folding chair, his face shadowed by the dim light. He crossed his arms, staring fixedly at the section of the map marked with the name Amphipolis. Callistratus can thunder about naval supremacy and Persian duplicity, all he likes in front of the ecclesia, Timagoras thought, a bitter, weary knot tightening in his stomach. He doesn't have to look the great king satraps in the eye or explain why an Athens stripped of Amphipolis and its northern timber supply is a dying beast. Pelopidas is already riding toward Susa with the prestige of Leuctra at his back. What do we have to offer the Persian court? Memories of Marathon? A democracy that can barely pay its rowers. The great king does not care about our maritime democracy, Callistratus, Timagoras spoke up, his tone flat and unyielding. Artaxerxes cares about tribute, stability, and whichever Greek power can guarantee peace on his western frontier. Pelopidas will offer him total mainland hegemony under Theban boots. If we walk into Susa empty-handed, shouting about our ancient rights to Amphipolis and our precious Second Athenian League, the Persian king's ministers will laugh us out of the throne room. One of the junior scribes nervously adjusted a parchment scroll, clearing his throat. What? What compromises are we authorized to make regarding the northern territory, sir? If the Assembly demands we hold fast to every foot of the Strymon, the Assembly in the Nyx lives in a dream world of past glories, Callistratus interrupted sharply. Though his eyes flashed with reluctant agreement, he stepped closer to Timagoras, lowering his voice. Listen to me, Timagoras. You must make the satraps see the danger of a unified Boeotian monster, controlling both land and sea. Remind them of the old Spartan hegemony, how Athens and Persia balanced each other when the Aegean had a check upon its waters. Tell them we will yield on minor border disputes, but Amphipolis and our grain route through the Hellespont are non-negotiable. If we lose the northern timber, we lose the trees that build our triremes. Without triremes, Athens ceases to exist. Timagoras slowly stood up, smoothing the front of his travel-worn chiton. He looked down at the map, tracing the long, perilous route his delegation would have to take across the sea and deep into the heart of the Persian domain. We are walking into the lion's den with a broken shield, Timagoras mused internally, a cold weight settling over him. If I stand firm, we risk a complete diplomatic rupture that leaves Athens entirely isolated. If I give too much ground, the mob in the Nyx will brand me a traitor and exile me before the winter ends. Either way, the fate of our city is resting on a knife edge thousands of miles from home. Pack the credentials, Timagoras said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. And bring extra gold for the satrapal gatekeepers. If we are going to stop Epaminondas's shadow from falling across the sea, we will have to buy every ear in Susa. Walls of Megalopolis. The crisp, biting wind of November swept down from the snow-dusted heights of Mount Menelaus, carrying the acrid stench of burning brush, wet mortar, and raw, churned earth across the vast plain of the Alpheus. Where once stood a scattering of independent pastoral villages and quiet farming hamlets, the heart of Arcadia was now a chaotic, roaring crucible of human labor. Thousands of men, farmers, shepherds, hoplites, and foreign stonemasons alike, toiled side by side under the gray autumn sky. Ox-drawn wagons groaned beneath crushing loads of gray limestone, quarried from the surrounding hills, their iron-shod wheels sinking deep into the muddy trackways as foremen screamed orders through rolled leather megaphones. Atop a newly raised earthen rampart overlooking the northern perimeter, Lycomedes of Mantinea stood with his hands resting firmly on his belt, his eyes tracking the geometric layout of the massive rising fortifications. Beside him, Aeneas of Stymphalus wiped a streak of white lime dust from his brow, watching as a team of laborers heaved a colossal ashlar block into place along the foundation line. The masonry is holding, but the winter rains will test every joint before the mortar has time to cure properly, Aeneas said, his voice carrying a note of weary concern. And the cynicism, bringing the stubborn folk from 50 separate villages into one unaccustomed city, is proving harder to manage with the sword than with speeches. Lycomedes let out a heavy breath, his gaze fixed on the endless stream of families trudging along the southern road, driving their cattle and carrying their household gods into the sprawling, half-built sanctuary of the new capital. They are leaving behind the graves of their ancestors, the hearths their grandfathers built, and the isolated valleys where their families have lived for centuries, Lycomedes thought. A profound sense of responsibility tightening, like a vice around his chest. To them, Megalopolis is not yet a city, it is a crowded, chaotic prison of stone and mud. But if we leave them scattered in their cozy, defenseless villages, Agesilaus and his Spartans will butcher them, one by one, come spring. We are forcing them to become a nation, whether they want to or not. They have to abandon their old boundaries, Aeneas Lycomedes answered quietly, his eyes hardening as he watched a group of Mantinean and Tegean farmers bickering over a pile of timber down in the trench below. If we remain a collection of soft, isolated hamlets, Sparta will carve us up whenever the mood strikes their efforts. Look at what Agesilaus did to our fields last year. Never again. A sudden commotion down by the main gateway drew their attention. A senior magistrate from Clitor, his face flushed and his garments stained with mud, was arguing heatedly with a squad of Arcadian guards, while a long line of displaced villagers waited impatiently behind him. You have no right to strip our district of its timber allotments, the magistrate shouted, shaking a fist in the air. Clitor contributed men to the Maria, not our lifeblood. You are draining our hills to build a monument for Megalopolis, while our own homes go unroofed. Lycomedes exchanged a swift, knowing look with Aeneas before turning and striding briskly down the earthen rampart, his military cloak snapping in the wind. "Lower your voice, magistrate," Lycomedes commanded, stepping into the center of the dispute with absolute, unyielding authority. The crowd of laborers and refugees instantly quieted, turning their eyes toward the league leader. The Clitorian magistrate swallowed hard, stepping back a half pace before squaring his shoulders defensively. "Lycomedes, I speak for men who are freezing in the open fields. We gave our silver to the federal treasury, and now we are told our forests are forfeit for walls that protect only this valley." Lycomedes stepped closer, his gray eyes piercing through the man's anger with cold, fierce intensity. He thinks of his local district, his petty little fields, his immediate comfort. Lycomedes mused inwardly, a surge of bitter frustration rising within him. He cannot see past the next hill. If the Spartans break through our center tomorrow, his precious timber will be burned to ash to warm Spartan tents, while his family runs for the mountains. "You think we are building these walls for vanity, magistrate?" Lycomedes asked, his voice dropping into a harsh, vibrating register that carried across the entire gateway. "Look around you. Every block of stone you see here is carved from the bones of our defeat at the tearless battle. Sparta does not negotiate with districts. She enslaves them. When Agesilaus marches his phalanx down from Laconia, he will not ask whether you are from Clitor, Mantinia, or Tegea. He will burn your farms, slaughter your sons, and drive your wives into chains." He gestured broadly toward the massive perimeter, where the stone foundations stretched out across the plain like the ribs of a sleeping leviathan. "We are combining 50 villages into a single, heavily defended urban center, because unity is our only shield against extinction," Lycomedes continued, his tone softening just a fraction, though his gaze remained unyielding. "Give your timber willingly to the Muriae magistrate. Help us lock this valley behind impenetrable stone. Because when these walls are finished, no Spartan king will ever dare tread upon Arcadian soil again." A heavy, breathless silence hung over the gateway for a long moment. The magistrate from Clitor looked down at his muddy sandals, the fire draining from his face as the terrifying weight of the truth settled over him. Slowly, he let out a defeated breath and nodded. "Take the timber," the magistrate muttered, turning away to rejoin his delegation. "Just make sure the walls are high enough." As the laborers resumed their work with renewed vigor, the rhythmic thud of mallets and the shouting of foremen once more filled the air. Aeneas stepped up beside Lycomedes. "You handled him well," Aeneas murmured, watching the limestone blocks rise against the gray horizon. "But the walls will only keep the Spartans out if the men behind them remember they are one people." "They will remember," Lycomedes said, resting his hand on the cold, rough stone of the gateway pillar. "Because if they forget, there is nothing left of Arcadia to save. Sanctuary and the sword." The sacred smoke rising from the great ash altar of Zeus drifted lazily into the damp November twilight, but inside the high-arched council chamber of the Aeolian sanctuary, the air tasted of sulfur, ash, and suppressed panic. Archidamus, the senior warden and chief archivist, stood by the tall, narrow window overlooking the darkening precinct of the Altes. Below, the bronze statues of past Olympic victors stood like silent, unblinking sentinels in the mist. But the peace they guarded was an illusion. The real world, brutal, fractured, and violently ambitious, was rapidly closing its iron jaws around the sacred valley of Elis. Around the cedar council table sat the high priests of Zeus and the senior magistrates of the Elean assembly. Philon, his face drawn tight with exhaustion, slammed a fresh intelligence report onto the polished wood, rattling the bronze oil lamps. "They have crossed the Alpheus," Philon announced, his voice sharp and trembling with suppressed fury. "A detachment of Arcadian border rangers from the Muriae has seized the outer hill forts of Triphylia. They are taxing our herds, intimidating our magistrates, and telling the local villagers that Megalopolis is now their sovereign protector. The Triphylian buffer zone is gone, Archidamus. We are standing naked on the edge of a knife." A heavy murmur of distress rippled through the seated priests. One of the elder keepers of the temple, his hands shaking as he clutched his woolen ceremonial robe, looked up with wide, desperate eyes. "They cannot do this," the old priest protested, his voice cracking. "Olympia is under the sacred protection of Zeus himself. For centuries, the Ekateria, the Holy Truce, has shielded our borders, and our lands from the ravages of war. No Greek state dares violate the immunity of the Altes without drawing down the unyielding wrath of the gods. Archidamus turned slowly away from the window, his weathered face carved from absolute, sorrowful realism. He walked over to the table, resting his callous fingertips on the edge of the parchment map. The gods are deaf to the march of pikes when a nation is starving for land and security, Archidamus thought, a cold, bitter knot tightening in his stomach. Lycomedes and the Federal Assembly in Megalopolis are not fighting for temple honors. They are fighting for their survival against Sparta. They look at our fertile Tryphilian pastures and our sacred revenues, not as a holy sanctuary, but as a wealthy, undefended prize waiting to be swallowed by the Arcadian League. Our sacred neutrality is just a piece of parchment scribbled in ink, and ink cannot stop a bronze spear. The gods protect those who hold their own walls. Venerable father, Archidamus said gently, his voice cutting through the priest's despair. We can wave our ancient decrees and shout about sacred immunity until our throats are raw, but Lycomedes will not hear us. To the Marii, Elis is not a neutral sanctuary. We are an obstacle blocking their path to the Western Sea. Philon looked up, his eyes burning with intense frustration. Then what are we to do? If we mobilize our militia and march south to retake Tryphilia by force, we break our own sacred laws of neutrality and invite pan-Hellenic condemnation. If we sit here behind our altars and do nothing, the Arcadian League will march up the Alpheus Valley and turn the Altes into a garrison stable before the winter ends. Archidamus pulled out his bronze stylus, tracing the winding, vulnerable line of the Alpheus River on the map. We are caught between a dying lion in Sparta and a rising wolf in Arcadia, Archidamus mused internally, staring down at the ink lines. We have no allies left across the Peloponnese. Athens is too far away and tangled in naval wars. Sparta is bleeding out in Laconia. We must play the only card we have left, buying time through diplomacy, while we sharpen our iron in secret. We do not march openly and we do not surrender, Archidamus said, his tone dropping into a hard, unyielding register. We send a formal, highly visible delegation to Megalopolis tomorrow morning. We will remind the Marii of the sacred pan-Hellenic curse that fell upon Sparta when they violated our borders years ago. We will shame them in front of every delegate from every free city in Greece. Philon narrowed his eyes, skeptical. And if Lycomedes laughs in our faces and tells our heralds to run back across the river? Archidamus straightened up, his gray eyes flashing with grim resolve. Then, while our heralds are reciting sacred law in the assembly hall at Megalopolis, our border commanders in Tryphilia will quietly double their watches, arm every shepherd who can hold a knife, and fortify the river passes. Let them think we are weak, pious priests relying only on prayers. When they step across our true threshold, they will find that the sanctuary of Zeus also knows how to bleed. To be continued in episode 20, Thessaly Wolf at the Gates. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Lagus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.